So I want to take the next 15 slides or so to discuss why we do it, why it's relevant, and how to go about it. So thanks for letting me share with you, and let's get started. What I'd like to do here is work through these two examples that you see on the slide. The first is from an app that came out in college athletics a couple years ago, and more universities are beginning to use it to gather information that's non-numeric that relates to analyzing the experience of student athletes on college campuses. So I want to use that to help us brainstorm when you might use qualitative research and how you might design a study. And then this bottom example here is from a published article, obviously, from this month, and something I just had a chance to read a couple days ago, and kind of gives a cool example of the entire qualitative process from start to finish. So I'll piggyback on these two studies to help apply it and have you make sense of the qualitative research process. So let's take a couple minutes to talk through how qualitative research differs from quantitative and why it might matter and when you might use it. So as you've been studying, I'm sure, with Dr. B, the history of science has sought largely to examine physical reality, to develop theory, and then out of which come hypotheses that you can test and collect information on, and numeric information, and then ultimately experiment, collect data, run statistical analysis on it to determine whether or not the particular hypothesis is supported, or whether or not you need to refine that hypothesis. So this has been fine and good and has led to some really good stuff in kinesiology and sports medicine for the last 100 years. And yet, the history of science and philosophers and other people have started to say, hey, this whole, what's sometimes called the hypothetico-deductive, a fancy way of saying basically this deductive process of collecting numeric data and analyzing it, is really good at a lot of providing a lot of answers to different questions, but it kind of fails and sputters related to social reality. The idea being, if I really want to know what social phenomenon or lived experience is like, numeric data and hypothesis testing only gets me so far. So this little cheesy cartoon to the right, you can read it, will hopefully make sense of what I'm saying. Let's say I rolled out a cart of free ice cream outside the CBU Lancer Athletic Performance Center next to the rec center, yeah? I roll out a cart and I just want to do some quantitative hypothesis testing sort of data collection. So I roll it out and I want to examine who takes the ice cream, how much do they take, and I want to categorize certain variables to see, do different types of groups of people, different samples take different amounts, or the frequencies, and whatever. I can run all kinds of different scenarios and collect data on a bunch of different variables and do frequency counts and even do some sophisticated statistical analysis. Fine and okay if I want to examine how much is being consumed. Let's say what we call descriptive or observational research, we could do that. And we could collect numeric data and get some decent level of information. But if my questions ran to a more social level of phenomenon, say I wanted to know about decision making and which types of athletes made certain decisions about whether to take the ice cream or not and how they felt about it. This is where qualitative research can shine in examining social reality, and can do this through non-numeric data collection techniques. Why? Because they want to get at social phenomenon. They want to get at, and they don't want to reduce the examination of taking ice cream from this free ice cream stand. They don't want to reduce it into categories and frequencies. They want to understand decision-making and what's going on in the student athlete's life, what his coach said about diet, what other factors, social phenomenon, come into account to help explain who took, how much, why, and how they felt. So this nice little example, qualitative methods would involve somebody like me going up to the person, sneaking out of the bush and sort of going up to the person and said, "What'd you feel when you first saw the ice cream? What went on in your head? Talk me through the decision making. What was it like?" So kind of a goofy example, but it captures the essence and the difference of qualitative research and the types of questions that it seeks to address. So I think what Dr. B wants you to hear from me is that, sure, quantitative approaches are what drive most of our knowledge in kinesiology, but that doesn't mean there aren't different ways of knowing. And even as a Christian kinesiologist, we should invite different ways of knowing and methods that seek to address different types of research questions in kinesiology, knowing that as Christians, we're called to love God with all our minds and to pursue truth in all different facets of life in a holistic way. So there's my plug for why it matters. So let's start to unpack a little bit of the differences, the real differences between quantitative and qualitative research. From our previous ice cream example, you would see on the right here that a quantitative approach would seek to reduce the decision-making process of the student athletes into as objective of categories as possible. Why? Because if we can collect frequency analyses and just check the box in terms of who took and how much, then we can use data and we can collect data and analyze it in precise ways, in objective ways, in order to test some pre-existing hypothesis and pre-existing ideas that we have about our variables. So on the quantitative side, we would say the whole approach is objective, is deductive in order to test certain pre-existing theories, and is primarily focused on reducing this complex phenomenon into smaller parts and doing that in as controlled a way as possible. Qualitative research is pretty much the exact opposite. Qualitative research seeks textual data, which just means words and images and things like that. And they collect that type of data because the whole approach seeks to be more holistic. We're not seeking to reduce high-level decision-making about dietary choices and whether or not to eat the ice cream, and psychological decision-making and sociological decision-making. We're trying to examine all the different facets of why student-athletes might choose to take the ice cream or not. And we're doing this in an inductive way. In other words, it's the reverse. I don't start out with a hypothesis and seek to collect data in order to prove or disprove or demonstrate or reject. I collect data in order to try to holistically explain what's going on. So you're trying to build general explanations or theory starting with the data rather than collect data in order to support or refute a certain pre-existing idea. So if we look into the middle of this Venn diagram, we see that both systems of research care about being systematic. They are both empirical, meaning they both collect data. They just collect different types of data, and they're both principled and driven by the question. But quantitative data seeks meaning by examining variables and the strength of the relationship between variables, or the strength of the impact of the independent variable on the dependent variable. Whereas qualitative research establishes meaning through the lived experiences and the social reality that the participants provide for the researcher. So meaning comes from a different focus on data collection and data analysis. A couple more thoughts on differences here. Because quantitative research is data focused and numeric data focused, then of course often quantitative experimental studies and observational studies want as large a sample as possible because they're trying to describe how many of a certain type of variable interaction is occurring. Therefore, the more data, the better. Large random representative samples are the hallmark of quantitative studies, again, because numeric data analysis is the driver of hypothesis testing. Qualitative research flips it and says the nature of the data is meant to be holistic and comprehensive, And yet, since statistical analysis is not the driver of hypothesis testing, then you can have a small and even non-random, or what we call purposeful, sample. There's no such thing as doing a power analysis on the front end of a qualitative study because you're not doing statistical analysis. So hopefully that doesn't sound like we're weakening the data. It's just that because the focus is different and non-numeric, then it allows for a smaller non-random sample. So one more slide on the differences here in data collection. This has to do with data analysis. On the quantitative side, the researcher tries to define reality upfront and to control all the variables, both that they want to examine and then the variables that they don't want to introduce error into the process. So researcher defines reality in order to test and control. On the qualitative side, the subjects themselves and the participants define reality. And often the researcher does not impose specific controls. Doesn't mean they don't standardize processes and that they don't seek to control data collection through interviews or observations that we'll talk about in a few slides. But you allow the participants to define reality for you. You're not coming to them with pre-existing survey questions or experimental techniques, okay? And here's the kicker, and here's the weirdest part maybe for some of us who have learned primarily the scientific method of hypothesis testing. In qualitative research, in the analysis phase, the researcher is the instrument for data analysis, and they're also the instrument for data collection. So think of this, how do you calibrate yourself? Yeah, if I'm doing a 1 rep max on some study and an intervention on strength for athletes, I just make sure my equipment is calibrated and that the tester knows what they're doing. On a qualitative side, data collection and analysis is only as good as the researcher who's collecting the data. So there's all kinds of ways to make sure that the data is valid and authentic. But this is a real difference between quantitative and qualitative. The researcher is the instrument for data collection and analysis. So given these basic differences and basic different starting points, quantitative and qualitative, let's talk through how you might design a study. Here's an article, you don't have to read it, but you can press pause on this slide if you want to read it. That I just talked about earlier. So there are these media and marketing companies who have developed an app, and they're marketing it to universities who are interested in understanding college athletic culture and the experiences of student athletes. So on the quantitative side, there are all kinds of ways that you can think of where you might collect observational, what we call descriptive survey studies, or even to design an experimental intervention. That's fairly easy, and I'm not going to spend time with how you would do that. But let's say you really wanted to know what's life like at CBU right now for student athletes. What are the social experiences? What are the decision-making processes? What's it like to live on campus during the pandemic or at any other time? Hopefully you can see that these sorts of social questions could lend themselves really well to a qualitative, holistic, textual data collection process. So the point is, when you see something like this, an app that student athletes can use, here's a couple more things. They use it anonymously. So if I'm a student athlete, I can log in on my app and I can participate and document my experiences and tell you what's working and what's not, and even report instances of abuse, discrimination, things that college athletic administrators would want to know about, but information that can be difficult to get on a survey. Fair? So this sort of thing would have a lot of potential for a qualitative study. So if we wanted to go ahead with our student athlete study regarding this, Real Recruit is the name of it, this Real Recruit app, you can see we could develop a quantitative study through a survey or an intervention. And essentially our purpose statement could be something like to examine the effects or the impact of this Real Recruit system on the incidence or prevalence of, let's say, depression symptoms or other symptoms of mental illness across campus. So we could design a quantitative purpose, but to contrast that, a qualitative purpose, here's some of the language. A couple of example purpose statements could be, first, to understand how student athletes cope with a no sports fall at a Division I Christian university. So we all know fall sports are out for CBU this semester. If we want to know how our athletes coping, what's the process that they're using to regulate their emotions, to develop healthy behaviors, how do they feel, what's it like to live through it, then notice the words here. Qualitative research seeks to understand and explore. It doesn't seek to examine or to quantify. A second qualitative purpose statement could be to explore the process of introducing a student-athlete feedback system to increase retention at a Division I Christian university. So again, qualitative research seeks a holistic explanation, collects textual data in order to get at and understand social phenomenon primarily. And then we'll talk about the design plan or method for data collection and data analysis in a couple of slides. So before we talk about how to collect data, qualitative data, let's revisit this idea of making sure that the overall process is good. We said quantitative and qualitative research both care about being systematic and principled and valid, and yet qualitative research goes about ensuring that this process is good in a different way. And the term that we use and that Dr. B may ask on your quiz is this term called triangulation. So triangulation is basically the way that qualitative research makes sure that the process is reliable and valid. So remember, if you as the researcher in a qualitative study, if you are the instrument for data collection and you are the instrument for data analysis, then your data is only as good as your ability to get good information and limit your own introduction of error into the process. So the way qualitative research does this is through a process of triangulation. And just think of it about like the term describes, if you remember the spy movies, you could always find where a person is in anywhere in the world by triangulating points of information, like a cell phone tower, and I don't know, old school phone booth, and then maybe a computer, and you bring those three sources of information together and you find the spy finds the person, right? It's the same idea that qualitative research seeks multiple sources of data, through multiple data collection strategies and multiple types of information. And even once they start analyzing the data, they do it through multiple theoretical frameworks. Okay, I just said a bunch of stuff there. But in our student athlete example, we could collect data, different types, like we could have them just key in their information through the app, but then we could also do follow-up interviews with people who choose to be interviewed, and we could even give them open-ended prompts where we have the women's softball team and the men's baseball team and whoever we want give us their story in an anonymous way. We might send a prompt and say, hey, please tell us what the first month back in the fall semester was like. So we get multiple types of information. And we do this through multiple data collection strategies. And then we get information from multiple people, not just women, men and women, not just varsity JV, not just individual team sports, not just team sports, but individual sports. So the way that qualitative research makes sure that the process is valid is by triangulating at all different levels. So this would be the equivalent of making sure you have enough power in a quantitative study, or making sure that the instruments are calibrated, and that they're up to date, and that you're using the right type of instruments in the first place. All right, sorry, I'm trying to stop my computer and it's not really working. Here, let's go back. Okay, so there's two ways to collect data in a qualitative study. The first is asking questions. So this is called an in-depth interview where you sit down with the person and you just ask specific questions. It can be a scripted questions, or it can be semi-scripted, or it can be completely conversational. It's your choice depending on the variables and the process that you want to know about. The second type of qualitative data collection is just called hanging out or observing. So think of people who like embed themselves with an athletics team and they follow them throughout the year. So for those who watched ESPN's documentary on the Chicago Bulls from the late 1980s, The Last Dance, right? Michael Jordan and their last dance when they were trying to win that final NBA championship. A cool documentary that really brings out what life was like on that Chicago Bulls team. The dysfunction, the function, kind of a behind the backstage pass to a team that I grew up watching. So it's kind of cool. You can see that observational research can give you really good high-level data through in-depth observation. But I would say if you look at this cartoon, remember there's always sort of a bias, and it's a sometimes deserved bias by quantitative researchers to say, hey, can you trust your own observations? Is that, I don't know that that's on the same level as getting good, valid data and analyzing it using statistics. My counter argument, of course, might be, well, if you're basing your entire if you're basing the entire results of your study on a p-value, we all know how arbitrary that can be as well. So there are strengths and weaknesses to both of these approaches, but yes, there is a real continued and sometimes fairly deserved bias against qualitative research as being too subjective. Therefore, the purpose of the triangulation slide that I showed you a little while ago. It's important for qualitative research to control for bias as much as possible by gathering multiple types of information from multiple sources and then analyzing it using multiple previous theoretical frameworks from the literature. Here's a quick slide that you can go back to, especially those of you who are considering doing some actual data, qualitative data collection. But basically, you can interview people individually, or you can interview them through focus groups, or you can observe them in different stages, and even you can do what's called more content analysis, where you're examining and analyzing textual data, but you're not getting it as a primary source from subjects. Maybe you're analyzing the cover of ESPN magazine over the last 20 years to identify themes as ways of explaining certain social phenomena. Let's say like the Black Lives Matter movement, you want to look at racial injustice or racial representation in the media. Qualitative research often can be secondary in nature as well, and can analyze and do what's called a content analysis of textual data. So those are options as well. So getting into qualitative data collection in terms of the interview, here's a couple of slides showing those of you who want to collect qualitative data how to ask good questions. This can seem simplistic, and sometimes it is, but it can be very difficult to do. Anybody who's interviewed someone else and gone back and listened to the recording or looked at the transcript, you know, sometimes you ask a question that really is spot on and it draws the participant out. And other times I can shut the interviewee down just by getting in the way and putting my foot in my mouth or using too much confusing language. So here's a quick rundown. We have to know the types of questions that we want to ask, and specifically the concepts and the very subjective social information that we want to know. We have to be clear in our own mind so that our questions are clear as well. And here's some simple things to avoid. Avoid dichotomous response questions. Don't lead them into a simple yes or no response. Otherwise, you've just undone the very thing you're trying to do. If all of your participants just respond yes or no, or sort of, then it's really hard to analyze that at a high level because they're not giving you any information. The whole purpose is to draw the participant out so you get good, holistic We call it rich data. And you do this often by using as open-ended of question as possible and yet not leading them into particular answers. It's a weird dance. It's not always easy to master. But here's your safeguard against just ruining the interview is knowing when to ask follow-up questions. Qualitative researchers call this probing. So just like the word implies, you're listening and discerning when to ask good follow-up questions. And any of you who are good communicators, and if any of you feel like people come up to you and say, oh, I can just tell you everything, you know what I'm talking about. It's those follow-up questions that really get you the good information. So qualitative researchers have to get good at conversing and asking the types of questions that will really draw the participant into giving you quality, meaningful information. Here we see another example of the types of questions you can ask, and I like this graphic of qualitative research is sometimes feeling like it's a little bit alien, like you're probing into some pretty sensitive information sometimes, which is why some of these questions can be gradual. In other words, I might start out with demographic, background information. Tell me your story. How long have you been in this job? How long have you been at CBU, for our example? What sport do you play? Even though you know some of the stuff, you ask these nice, easy demographic questions in order to develop rapport. And you might say knowledge questions come next. It doesn't have to follow in a linear way, but often you're building rapport. And then you get into some of these deeper level questions of feeling, sensory experience. What was it like to be in that situation? Or so typically what I like to do is say, okay, go back to that time, whatever the time was. Imagine you're there now. Take me through what it's like. And then they just start talking about whatever they want to talk about as it relates to lived experience about that topic that you care so much about knowing. Again, the idea is get as holistic of data as you can. Okay, a couple more slides and we're done. The final phase here of qualitative research is analysis, is answering the so what question. You've taken your time. You've realized the need for holistic textual data. You're collecting it through interviews or observations. I know I didn't talk very much about observational research. We need to move on, but I'm happy to discuss it with those of you who might be considering qualitative research. But obviously, interviews are the primary means of data collection for most qualitative research. Okay, once we have the data, it's time to analyze it. Here's a little cheeky quote, but it's certainly relevant. Data analysis is the important part. So the quote, the person who knows how, let's say, to collect qualitative interview data, they'll always have a job. But the person who knows why and what it all means once they get the qualitative data, they'll be his or her boss. The point is cheeky, but still, knowing how to analyze qualitative data is the tough part, but is the rewarding part once you are able to do it because of the level of understanding that it can give. So qualitative data analysis involves three basic activities, and these activities can seem basic, but they can be pretty messy as well, and it can take you a while to go through this process. The first step is to reduce the amount of data that you have. On the quantitative side, let's say you collect a bunch of survey numeric data and you dump it into SPSS, and it can be time consuming to do that. Similar on the qualitative side, you have a lot of transcript notes typed out, or you have a lot of field notes from your observational data, and that data needs to be reduced. And once it's reduced and categorized, you start the data analysis process. And in qualitative research, again, remember it's inductive. I'm taking quotes or I'm taking observational notes and I'm trying to build categories. And then inductively, I'm trying to lead into a higher level of analysis. We call them themes and even theory. But the idea is you take chunks of textual information and you work with it and you analyze it and you process it in order to form conclusions about what your participants are saying and thinking and what the reality is like for them. So essentially you do this through the textual information and you develop categories, and sometimes they're called codes, and you build them into higher level of explanation called themes. And then as you work with themes over and over again that seek to explain your data, you form some general dimensions or theory that seeks to explain the themes overall. Let's show a brief example to try and bring this all together. So here's the study that I mentioned in the first slide. It's a qualitative interview study of 12 elite distance runners. I think they're all from Kenya. So the basic question was, how did these elite runners manage the stresses of life and manage their training and schedule in order to peak at the World Championships and to fight off all the distractions and to do well? So this, hopefully you see, this is a type of research question where, sure, we could have them circle numeric responses on a survey, but that doesn't quite capture the level of data that we want. So these interviewers worked with 12 athletes, in-depth interviews at key points in these athletes' training and decision-making, and they asked them questions. And from these interview transcripts, the researchers built codes or categories that sought to explain the one-on-one interviews, and then they built higher level of explanation called themes, and then they finally produced a theory to help explain why some runners were able to cope well and to peak at the right time, and why other runners may not have been as successful. So let's go through pictures here. So basically what they would get would be a transcript of specific quotes that these runners might have given them in an interview. So you see these quotes right here to the right. Then from all these quotes, they would try and organize and analyze these quotes. What did they have in common? Where were they similar? Where were they different? And they start to build categories, or what are called codes, that seek to explain at a secondary level what's going on. How did some elite runners overcome the environmental strains and overcome injury, and in this case what they really found was, how did some runners manage their workload in a way and know how to stay ahead of that, whereas other runners would overtrain and try and push through when it didn't make sense and when it didn't benefit their overall performance. So then you see that from the quotes, you build into categories of things like environmental strain or anxiety that comes from external pressures or the threat to their income. Remember, marathoners and elite runners, they make money from sponsors based on the number of races that they participate in. So these categories here, or codes, are really working definitions that seek to explain the quotes. And often qualitative researchers will refine these categories as they seek a better understanding. So they'll go back and forth between the quotes and these categories to better understand and explain what the participants are actually saying. And then eventually they arrive at these primary themes that are usually somewhere between 4 to 6. They're not a ton of themes that seek a higher level of explanation. Remember, this inductive process where you start from the textual data and you're trying to achieve something close to a hypothesis or a theory that explains the data at a higher level. So then here's an example of what would be called theory in qualitative research. So again, from the participant interview data, the researchers were able to conclude that high-level successful endurance runners were able to go through this injury and illness process where, as they experienced symptoms that threatened to slow down their training or that even threatened to remove them from participation, they went through two major decision-making steps. They either learned educated flexibility, which involved how to manage their cognition, how to manage their anxiety, how to manage the environmental strain of lost potential income or mixed information from coaches and sports medicine staff, and they learned how to adapt their sports load and their training schedule and their periodization in specific ways that were well timed. And if they could manage that, all the environmental strains, and not overtrain or try to run through the pain, then they experienced normal performance, they accomplished their goals, made money, and were highly successful. And so it does not mean that some runners didn't run through the pain and didn't decide to train when maybe they could have taken a rest day. So there was another path here called exigency, which is just a fancy way of saying they were still able to manage the decision-making process. They just chose to run through the pain, to shorten the rest day in order to maximize performance benefits. And yet it was the proper and the accurate decision because they had taken all these other factors into consideration and had worked through a healthy decision-making process. So in qualitative research, this is the theory. This figure or this visual image is often the highest level of explanation that you get in qualitative research. And this would be the theory or the explanation that is grounded in the qualitative data. So often qualitative research, you'll hear the term grounded theory because the purpose is to explain lived experience, social phenomenon, in this case, decision-making related to injuries and environmental strains and training made by elite athletes in order to compete at a high level. So hopefully you can see, for some of you, you go, wow, this gives a pretty satisfying level of explanation. It's albeit different, right? It's not the same as a predictive quantitative study that says, if you take this much of a supplement, then this is what you can guarantee in terms of an outcome. In some ways, it's not as clean, but hopefully through this long presentation here, it's getting a little long, my apology, you've seen the potential that qualitative research gives you to make sense of social phenomenon in just a different way. So with that, I'll leave you and answer your so what question. Your research question should drive your research design. And for those of you who are primarily interested in understanding social phenomenon, and especially understanding something from the perspective of the participants themselves, where you need them to tell you or you need them to show you, then qualitative research can give a satisfying process and can even give you results that are just as true and valid as other types of research, as long as you follow some of the tools I've given you in terms of triangulating and making sure you get good, reliable information. There's another word here on mixed method. So you may hear the term mixed method designs. As it sounds, you're mixing quantitative and qualitative approaches, which means you're mixing both types of data and even both types of data analysis. Again, because your research question might need and call for two different approaches, then you put them together. Yes, those designs can be especially challenging and hard to grapple with, but they can often produce really good research findings. So thanks for hanging in there. And even still, it's much shorter than a typical class period would be. So you are welcome for that. And I've left you a couple other things on this PowerPoint presentation you can look through. I put an abstract from one of my own recent publications so you can see another example of qualitative research. And thanks to Dr. B for letting me ramble on a little bit here. For those of you who might be interested in doing at least part of your proposal for this class from a qualitative perspective, feel free to reach out, email, or stop by the office if you're on campus, and I'm happy to brainstorm with you and be a resource for you. Okay, take care. Thanks for listening.